Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on business research methods, today we are going to talk on concepts and theories of business ethics. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Namita Rajput. Dr. Namita Rajput is a principal in Sri Aurobindo Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Rajput is a prolific professor. She has authored numerous books and a number of her articles have been published in reputed journals. So friends, let's take advantages from Dr. Rajput's experiences and let's try to understand today's topic in detail, that is the concepts and theories of business ethics. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Good morning friends. Today we have a very pertinent topic, that is the ethics and the theories of ethics. We have already seen the conceptual framework of ethics. Ethics has been derived from a Greek word ethikos, which means the character. But in the common parlance and in the contemporary parlance, the concept of ethics has gone a sea change, and we now call it as the way or a different connotation. We call it as a characteristic, attitude, and the group of people and the culture and so on. So when we talk of the business ethics, we mean the attitude, culture, and the manner of doing a business of the business communities. And definitely there is a common consensus in this regard, that there are so many theories which says that the philosophers, they always use interchangeably the concept of ethics and morality. Now to them, morality refers to a human conduct and the values, whereas if we see the ethical aspects and the ethical backdrop of it, the ethics refers to the study of the human character or business behavior in relation to moral values. That is the study of what is morally right and what is morally wrong. In the ordinary parlance, the people use these expressions interchangeably, and when we say something was done ethically or morally, we mean that the things were done correctly. So when you say all these things, that means the ethics has been a concept, and it revolves around the rightness and the wrongness of an action, the rightness and the wrongness of a conduct, and whether the act is true or false, whether the act is right or wrong. So overall, this theory of ethics is revolving around the concept of the right and the wrongness of a conduct or an action. Now with this backdrop, let me give you some definitional aspects of the ethics. Ethics is a branch of axiology which, together with metaphysics, logic, and epistemology, constitutes the philosophy. Ethics attempts to find out the nature of morality and to define and distinguish what is right from what is wrong. Ethics is also called as a moral philosophy. Ethics, according to Velasquez, is a study of the moral standards whose explicit purpose is to determine, as far as possible, whether the given moral conduct, moral judgment based on that standard is more or less correct or not. Many ethicists asserts that there is always a right thing to do on a moral principle, while others subscribe to a broader view that the right thing to do and depends on a situation. So this is all situational in nature. That is, a particular conduct or an act can be right, it can be wrong. But what defines the morality of an action? What defines the conduct of an action? It is basically, there are two concepts which you have to keep in mind. One, it is either the right way of doing a thing, number one, or number two, what are the consequences after doing and pursuing that action. So there are so many aspects and things which has to be properly incorporated before we judge a particular conduct or an action to be right or wrong. Now, basically to many philosophers, ethics is a science of a conduct, and definitely, according to Epicurus, the philosopher defines ethics as a science which deals with the things to be sought and the things to be avoided, with the ways of life, with the telos, which means the chief aim or the end in life. Like one of its later offshoots, economics, ethics is also imprecise as it deals with the human behavior that cannot be placed in a straitjacket. So definitely every human being has its own story. It has its own upbringing. There are so many people which are around us, which influence us. There is a carry forward of your childhood memories onto your adulthood. So definitely the things which you comprehend, the things which you culminate as and when you grow in life, it is definitely different. So my behavior would be different from the other's behaviors would be different from others. So we cannot have one common parlance or straight yes and no to say and to judge whether the action is right or wrong. So that is why we call it as a imprecise science. Why? Because you are dealing with the human behavior. Human behavior keeps changing because of the circumstances, because of your upbringing, because of your peer pressures, because of your overall scenario in which your life journey is there. So definitely this concept of ethics is a very, very different story altogether. You have to be very, very, broader in terms of culminating and comprehending everything in deep, so that you are able to judge whether the actions which you take is true or false, or right and wrong. Now definitely if you talk to any economist, for that matter, if you want to ask a definition of economics from 5 economists, it is very strange that you will have always more than 6 to 7 definitions in front of you. Similarly, if you ask the ethicist that what is the conceptual framework of ethics, so again you will have n number of definitions in front of you. So under this backdrop, we can conclude that it is very difficult to have a common understanding as far as the definitional aspect of ethics is concerned. Now, at the time of about more than 2,500 years, the Platos and the Socrates, they have their own views to, understand. They have their own views to say. And definitely, ethics is a vast and covers the length and the breadth of the human behavior. That makes it even more difficult to comprehend, because it is the most difficult thing when you are dealing with the human behavior. You cannot have a common understanding, a straitjacket as far as their behavior is concerned. Now, many ethicists, they refer to call the ethics as a study of a philosophy of the human conduct, with the main emphasis on determining the right and the wrong. The most dictionaries define ethics as a science of morals in the human conduct, moral philosophy, moral principles, rules of conduct, the definition, etc. The American Heritage Dictionary is more focused, the study of general nature of morals and the specific moral choices, moral philosophy, and the rules of the standards governing the conduct of the members or a profession. Now, I'll give you a few more definitional aspects of it so that you're very clear about the insights and the definitional aspect of the concept of ethics. According to Farrell et al., values and judgments play a very critical and pivotal role when we make ethical decisions as compared to the ordinary decisions. And to my understanding, to take the ethical decisions is the most difficult task, because you're standing on crossroads. You don't know whether way 1 is good or way 2 is good, because there are so many different definitions and various circumstances which affect your decision making as far as the ethical aspects is concerned. You have to see the situation at large. You have to see the actors which are involved in it. You have to see the situation which is, defining the concept of the ethical decision making, followed by whether the decisions which you are taking is correct or not. Are you not doing any harm to anyone? Does it give any benefit to people at large, or it is only giving the benefits to an individual? So these are so many questions which you have to answer before you take the ethical decision making, which is definitely a very, very difficult task to make. So in sum, we say that ethics is a moral decision, a normative science. The norms, they focus on what ought to be. So it refers to the principle that define the human behavior as right, good and proper. However, it should be stressed, and these principles do not lead to a lead of the course of the action. But of course, it means an evaluating and deciding among competing options. So overall, I can give an example to make you understand the concept of ethics and the ethical decision making, and to conclude whether the actions which you take is right and wrong. Now, for example, or one of the acts or the conduct of an individual, this is just the illustration to explain you the conceptual framework of ethical decision making and the basis and the backdrop of taking the ethical decision making. So I was talking about that if you take an individual decision, that individual decision is saving you at large, but it is not in the interest of the people at large, or it is not giving benefits. The offshoots of your decision making is not giving any kind of benefits to the people at large. So if your comprehension is to take individual decision making which is only benefiting you, you are being individualistic in nature. Whereas if you take any kind of a decision which is giving the benefits to the public at large, so we call it as what? We call it as a utilitarianism, or the mass decision making, which is giving the benefits to the masses, not to the individual who is taking that decision. So now there is a big question mark whether the first situation wherein the decision making which was done on the individual centric concepts, whether that is right or wrong. Similarly, if you take any kind of a decision making which is giving the benefits to the public at large is right or wrong. So this is the ethical dilemma which has to be very nicely understood, so that you understand that whether decision 1 was good, wherein the benefits was only being given to the individual, or the decision 2 was good, which is giving the benefits to the public at large, which we call it as a utilitarianism. So it is definitely, there are two ways of taking any kind of ethical decision making. One, which is giving the individual centric approach. Number 2, which is giving a society at large benefit approach, that is the utilitarianism. So there is a big question mark and there is a big debate in your mind, and you're standing on the crossroads that whether 1 is good or 2 is good. Again, if you ask me, both the decisions are good. Why? Because you are having to protect yourself is no crime. If you are there, only then you will be able to take the benefits for the society at large. But yes, decision 2 is also good. Why? Because it is giving the benefits to the public at large. So it is on the individual comprehension, individual decision, completely based on his own knowledge, wisdom, and the circumstantial aspects which he incorporates into the decision making. So we call it as both the decisions are good, both are ethical. We cannot outrightly reject individualism, and of course we cannot embrace the complete decision of utilitarianism. As and when the circumstances allow you, take a decision, because every decision, whether it is individualistic based or it is society based, both are good, both are ethical. So the only thing which you have to justify here, the ethical justification, you have to very clearly define the ethical justification in terms of your own decision making. Now we start with the theories of ethics, and these theories are so interesting, and the coming few more sessions also we would be doing in detail these theories, so that you have a great and a complete comprehension about how the theories evolved, how the decision making happened, because you have to always keep the yardsticks and the thresholds of these theories in front of you in order to take the ethical decision making. So the first theory we start today is a normative theory. The ethics is a normative study, that is an investigation that attempts to reach the normative conclusions. Again, normative, we call it as the what ought to be decision making. It aims to arrive at conclusions about what things are good and what things are bad, or what actions are right and what actions are wrong. In other words, a normative theory aims to discover what should be, and would include the sentences such as companies should follow the corporate governance standards, or the managers ought to act in a particular manner to avoid the conflict of interest. This is a study of moral standards which are correct or supported by the best reasons, and of course to attempt to reach the conclusions about the moral rights and wrongs and the moral good and evils. For instance, the stakeholder theory has a normative thrust and is closely linked to the way the corporations should be governed and the way the managers should act. So definitely when you talk about the normative theories, it gives you the particular guidelines, it gives you the particular overall the plan of action, the decision making criteria, the best direction in terms of which you can take the best decision, because these are all ethical based. It gives you the guidelines for the managers that this is a good way to take a decision, and similarly it gives the guidelines to all the people who are associated with the decision making that this is the right way and this is the wrong way of taking any kind of a decision making. So normative theories gives you a great and a clear, crystal clear guidelines in terms of which you can take a long and a good decision making. There are different normative perspectives and of course the ethical principles that often contradict with one another. These are consequentialist and non-consequentialist normative theories. We can identify the following ethical theories that have an impact and a manner in which the ethics or the lack of it could be identified in a business organizations. So these are, according to William, the following will be taking over now, but let me explain you the concept that how these normative theories behave. So when you talk about the normative theories, that is what ought to be, which gives you the guidelines for the best decision making, ethical decision making criteria. It benefits the managers, it benefits the employees, it benefits the overall leaders of the organization who are associated with taking the vital and the pertinent decision making for the corporate sector. Now, when you talk about the decision making, there are two types. One, which is consequentialist, and the second is which is non-consequentialist. When you talk about the consequentialist theory, which is definitely a part of the normative theory, the consequentialist theory, it focuses on that what are the consequences of your decision making. So whether your judgment, where you call it as the ethical decision making, whether it is right and wrong, will depend upon the consequences. So when you talk about the normative consequentialist theory, the focus is on what? The focus is on the consequences, which is an offshoot of your own decision making. If the consequences are good, we call it that your act is good. If your consequences are bad, we call it that your conduct is bad. So this is one judgment. Now coming on to the second aspect of the consequentialism, the non-consequentialism normative theory talks about that you are not taking care of or you are not centering on the consequences, wherein you are giving a lot of focus on the means, that is the means which you adopt in a particular conduct or an action. So means to an end is what you judge. The means should be good. The means should not be bad. So we call it as the non-consequential normative theory of ethical decision making. The first, that is the consequentialism, your centric is what? Your centric is consequences. You're not bothered about the means which you adopt, but you are just bothered about the consequences. The second, definitely in opposite to this or in diverse of this, we center around the means, not the consequences. Even if the consequences are bad, your means should be good, whereas in the first part, your consequences should be good, irrespective of the means which you adopt. So in one, that is the consequential based normative theory, the centering is on the consequences, whereas if you see the other aspect of it, that is the non-consequential normative theory, the focus is on means, not the ends. So this is how, again, I'm giving you a very, very clear understanding on the ethical decision making. Whether you take means as a criteria or you take the consequences as a criteria, the decision is purely yours. If you see the benefits which is giving, that particular conduct is giving benefits to the individual, that is also good. If it is giving the benefits to the public at large, then also it is good. So you can see here that you have to, when you take an ethical decision making, You have to comprehend so many things together, and you have to see them in one frame, because you're seeing the metaphysics also, you're taking the epistemology also, you're taking the economics also, you're taking the mathematical aspects also. So it's a culmination of so many disciplines together that we call it that this decision is right or this decision is wrong. So, having pick and choose aspects, that is, even if only you see the means or if you see only the ends, this is not the criteria, and this is not a right way of judging the ethical moral decision making. You have to see in one frame n number of things together. You have to analyze them, you have to examine them, you have to comprehend them, and of course, after taking into consideration and incorporating these small aspects together into one frame, your decision making would be the best decision making ever. Now, coming on to the various aspects, that is, in the organizational context, we can identify the ethical theories that have an impact on the manner in which the ethics or the lack of it could be identified. So now we are talking about the ethical theories in the corporate scenario. That is, when you are in a corporate or a business, what particular theories will you have to go through and which you have to incorporate while taking any kind of an ethical decision making. The first is egoism, the second is utilitarianism, the third is a Kant Ethics, and the last is your non-consequentialism normative theories. So we would be taking one by one. In the coming sessions, we would be focusing each lecture on each theory so that you have a clear understanding of the various aspects as far as the ethical aspects is concerned and the corporate ethical theories are concerned, because we are talking, and this business series is on the business ethics. So we focus on the business and we focus on the ethics, and a combination is called as a business ethics. So we are now starting with the theories of business ethics, which is used in the corporate scenario, wherein the first theory which we are talking now is egoism. What is egoism? As the name suggests, both are ethical theory and they have a philosophical theory. When you talk about utilitarianism, the theory that a morally right action results in the greatest good to the largest number of the people. The Kant's Ethics, which emphasizes on moral motivation and respect for the persons, whereas the last one we call it as non-consequentialist normative theories, duties, moral rights, and prima facie the principles. Now we would be talking on the modern ethical theory, that is the utilitarian ethics. Now, utilitarianism is the first ethical theory ever that we need to consider. Utilitarianism has had a significant impact on the modern world and has been specifically used in the modern corporate scenario. Now, what does the utilitarian ethics define? It defines what? When you take any kind of a business decision, you have to see and comprehend one aspect, one tagline, that is, whether the conduct is giving a largest benefit to the largest number of people. So, if it is, the answer is yes, you move ahead. If the answer is no, you take a step back. So, in the utilitarianism Kant theory of ethics, we see that the conduct or an action taken by an individual is giving a lot of benefits to the largest extent and the substantial section of the people, then of course we say yes, and if it is not, we do not take that decision or we step back. Now we would be taking in detail the Kant ethics. The influential, definitely these ethics, that is, the utilitarianism had a significant impact on the modern world and has been specifically influential in shaping the politics, economics, and the public theory. So it is therefore continues to have an enormous influence on the business. It will be useful to start our consideration by locating the utilitarianism within its historical context. The roots of utilitarianism thinking can be found in Thomas Hobbes. In 1588 to 1679, David Hume from 1711 to 1776, Adam Smith from 1723 to 1790. But the classic for modifications are found in the work of Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Each of these social philosophers was writing against and background of the great democratic revolutions of the 17th and the 18th century. Utilitarianism tells us that we can determine the ethical significance of any action by looking to the consequences of the act. Utilitarianism is typically identified with the policy of maximizing the overall good in a very slightly different version, or producing the greatest good for the greatest number. The acts that accomplish this aim are good, and they do not, if they are not good, we do not take those decisions. So this emphasis is on the overall good and upon the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. Friends, you are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Dear friends, as you know that today we are talking on concepts and some of the theories of business ethics. Though in our previous session we discussed on concepts in detail, now in this session we will try to cover maximum of the theories of the business ethics. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Namita Rajput. Dr. Namita Rajput is an eminent professor, and we believe that you gather maximum knowledge through her. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Namita Rajput. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
In the last lecture, we talked about certain ethical conceptual framework, but this particular aspect I will cover as far as the ethical theories is concerned in this session. So, I have just given you the brief scenario of what utilitarianism theory is all about. So, let me start all over again so that you have a complete understanding of what utilitarianism is all about. Utilitarianism is the first ethical modern corporate theory. We need to consider the utilitarianism has been a very significant impact on the modern corporate world, because here we see the conduct is endorsing the maximum benefits to the maximum number of people. So, we talked about a certain theoretical backdrop, that when it started, who were the contributors and propounders of these theories. So, majorly the roots were with the Thomas Hobbes, Adam Smith, David Hume, Jerry Bentham and the Stuart Mill. Each of these were the social philosophers and were writing against a background of the great democratic revolutions of the 17th and the 18th century. Utilitarianism tells us that we can determine the ethical significance of any action which you take by looking to the consequences of that act. Utilitarianism is typically identified with the policy of maximizing the overall good, or in a very slightly different version of producing the greatest good for the greatest number. The acts that accomplish this aim are good, and those that do not are very bad. This emphasis on the overall good and upon producing the greatest good for the greatest number directly opposed authoritarianism policies that aim to benefit the political elite. Utilitarianism provides a strong support for the democratic institutions and the policies. The government and all social institutions exist for a social well-being of all, not a further interest of monarch, the nobility, or for some small minority. Likewise, the economy exists to provide this greatest standard of living for the greatest number of people, not to create a wealth for a privileged few. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist ethics. As I already explained, the consequentialist ethics is all about you see the consequences, which is an offshoot of your conduct or inaction. If the consequences are good and giving benefits to the people at large, we call it that decision making is good. There are some 11 times we determine that we should be and should not be taking something as a matter of principle regardless of the consequences. Whenever we look to this approach in more detailed in the next section, we'll be talking the utilitarianism by the pragmatic thinkers. No act is ever right or wrong in all case and in every situation. It will all depend upon the consequences. For example, lying is neither right nor wrong in itself. There might be situations in which lying will produce greater overall good than telling the truth. In such a situation, it would be ethically right to tell a lie. Consider an example, the case from start of its chapter. Should the US government pass a law that limits the amount of money corporate CEOs can be paid, or at least that can be credited as tax deductible? The utilitarianism approach to this action will consider the likely consequences of either alternative. Limiting the amount of executive salary that can be deducted from the taxes should provide a disincentive to the corporations to pay such large salaries. In a world of infinite and finite resources, this should not work to increase the average pay for other workers or lower the cost of the consumers. On the other hand, the lower salaries might make it more difficult to attract the highly qualified executives to the US firms, as I'm giving you a research piece of work of the US, because all these has a base from the US and wherein you can always comprehend about what utilitarianism pragmatic thinkers think about it. So the lower salaries might make it very difficult to attract the highly qualified executives for the US firms and could result into a less competitive US companies. This would result in harm to everyone, including lower paid workers and consumers. Either way, the ethical judgment made about the decision is a function of what happens after the fact. By reasoning in this way, utilitarianism acknowledges two different types of values. The most value judgments are the judgments of instrumental values, for example, telling a truth and allowing the manufacture of the generic drugs are available as a means or an instrument to end the producing of some greater good job. But there must be a good reason, sometimes valued for its own sake, which is at the end for which the other acts aim. We can judge our acts in terms of their consequences. Then we must have some independent standard for deciding between good and bad consequences. There must be something of intrinsic value by which we can judge the consequences of our acts. All utilitarians agree that good and bad is a function of maximizing the overall good. They disagree, and of course, we find different versions of utilitarianism over what is valued not for its consequences but for itself. In general, the utilitarian position is that happiness is the ultimate good. The only thing that is and can be valued for its own sake is the happiness. So it is very difficult to comprehend sometimes about the different types of utilitarianism, the number of thoughts by the different philosophers, and so on and so forth. So does it sound absurd to you to claim that unhappiness is good and happiness is bad? Of course, this is a very conflicting statement. The goal of ethics, both individually as a matter of public policy, should be to maximize the overall happiness. But what exactly is happiness? According to Bentham, he argued that only pleasure, or at least the absence of pain, was intrinsically valuable. Happiness, according to Bentham, must be understood in terms of a pleasure, and in the absence of pain, unhappiness is understood as a pain or deprivation of pleasure. On the Bentham view, pleasure and pain are the two fundamental motivational factors of the human nature. In his own words, that is, if you see a particular concept of pleasure in doing a conduct, then also you see. If you not see the happiness, if you only see the absence of pain, then also you move ahead with that decision. So these are the motivational factors behind the ethical decision making as far as the utilitarian concept is concerned. Nature has placed a mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, that is pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out that we ought to do as well as determine what shall do. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, and in all we think. Consider the Bentham utilitarianism reasoning, that is, only pleasure and the absence of pain are valued for its own sake. So this is a very, very important statement which has been contributed and propounded by Mr. Bentham. That is, you give a particular reasoning behind taking the ethical decision making. One is the pleasure which you get in having that conduct, whereas the second is the absence of pain, which is also a motivational factor behind, and they have their own value of its own self and for its own sake. Only pleasure and the absence of pain, therefore, are intrinsically, objectively, and disputably good. If pleasure and the absence of pain are good, more pleasure, less pain is better, and maximum pleasure is the best. So therefore, maximizing pleasure is the fundamental objective and indisputable ethical discipline. imperative to maximize the pleasure sounds very egoistic. Utilitarianism differs from egoism in many important ways. Egoism neither philosophically or ethically focuses on the happiness of an individual. Utilitarianism acts are judged by its consequences for the general and for, of course, the overall good. The consistent with their own commitment to democratic equality, however, the general good includes the well-being of each individual affected by an action. While agreeing with the general framework of Bentham, utilitarianism, John Stuart defended a very different understanding conceptual framework of happiness. Stuart Mill believed that there is a qualitative dimensions to the happiness that is missed by Bentham. To focus on the pleasure, human happiness is not mere hedonism. According to Mill, humans are capable of enjoying a variety of experiences that pints. Besides the pleasures of sensation that Bentham mentions, the humanistic preference, social and intellectual pleasures that are qualitatively different. So, the John Stuart Mill gave entirely a different dimension as far as the ethical decision making of the utilitarianism concept is concerned. He focused on the qualitative aspects of measuring the pleasure, which was missed by the other person. So, definitely from superior to more feelings, and in a famous passage, Mill claims that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So just see the statement. The statement is all about the quantitative measure which was missed by Bentham. So John Stuart Mill gave a very different conceptual framework and incorporated the quantitative pleasures which can be measured. So the claim that is form of the happiness is qualitatively, and of course the sensation of pleasures is very controversial. How do we know, or how do we can prove that it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied? So there is a significant ethical and social implications for it, wherein we can decide about it. To decide which pleasures and what type of happiness is better, according to Mill, we should consult with someone with the experience of both. Such experienced and competent judges are the best test for determining the highest happiness. Of the two pleasures, if there will be one to which all or most all whom have experience of both give a decided preference, that is, the more desirable pleasures. And if disagreement continues beyond this, the Mill next suggests that from the verdict of the only competent judges, I comprehend there can be no appeals on a question which is the best worth of having two pleasures. The judgment of those who are qualified by the knowledge of both, or they are different, that of majority of them must be admitted at final. So, we can conclude that according to Stuart Mill, it acknowledges that not all opinions are equal. Some people are more competent, more qualified than the others in judging what is good. The Mill utilitarianism does not support an uncritical majority rule in which every opinion of what is good is treated equally valid. However, we should not be abundant, democratic because of this. The way to develop the competent judges is thoroughly an experience and education. People need to be educated and experienced in a variety of pleasures before they are competent to judge. Once they are experienced, then the majority rule democracy is the best way of making a decision. According to John Stuart Mill, we find one of the classic defenses of the liberal democratic and liberal education. The most fundamental ethical principle commits us to arranging a society in such a way that we maximize the happiness for the greatest number of people. The best means of attaining this goal is an educated citizenry making decisions through a majority rule democracy is the best. Of securing an educated citizenry to allow the individuals the freedom of choice to pursue their own ends, Even when these decisions are unwise, the individuals are gaining the experience indeed by distinguishing the good and bad, higher and lower pleasures. The views which have significant implications for the business and economics. In classical free market economics, consumer demand is a sovereign. Economic transactions occur when individuals seek their own happiness, understood as getting what they demand, and if individuals make mistakes and buy products, all that fail to bring them satisfaction, they learn from their mistakes, no longer buy the product according to the supply and demand. Market forces eventually eliminate the unsatisfactory products. The utilitarianism greatest contributions to the social and political thought has come from the influence in economics, which has its roots from the Adam Smith as well, because we are looking and taking care of the cost factor, the pleasure factor, and how do we define the gains and the profits out of it. So we have its roots in the economics, which was propounded by Adam Smith. The law of supply and demand tells us that the economics should be healthy and to produce what the supply is, to consume what demand is. Since the scarcity and the competition prevent everything from getting all that we want, the goal of a free market economics is optimally satisfy the wants. The free market accomplishes this goal by allowing the individuals to decide for themselves, and the most want they bargain from their goods and services in a competitive marketplace. When you talk about this process is definitely allowing an individual to set their own particular preferences and bid for them in the marketplace. Over time, under time, right conditions guarantee optimal satisfaction and their wants. So these are the scenario and the comprehension of these things together, on the basis of which you take the ethical decision making. The brief description suggests that how the market economist fits the utilitarianism framework. The end or a goal of an economic activity, what economists often refer to as a utility or a welfare, is a maximum satisfaction of the consumer demand. We do not do the most of the things for the greatest number of the people, and we must get them as the people as possible, and for them they want as much as possible. The good is defined in terms of satisfying one's own wants, but the scarcity, competition and other things, they prevent us from getting us what we want as individuals. We are left to rank order their wants and indefinitely, in other words, to establish their own preferences. So thus in the market economies, they can be brought to as a version of the preference utilitarianism. The utilitarianism goal is the maximum satisfaction of the preferences which has been given by the consumers at large. So given this goal, the free market economist, they advise us to take the most efficient means to attain that goal is to structure our own economy according to the principles of the free market economy. We should allow the individuals the freedom to bargain for themselves in an open, free and competitive marketplace. Self-interested individuals, as we say, they are definitely in the mainstream, and if you see the overall scenario, there are few people, and in fact the 80 to 90% of the people who just take care of their own self, their own personal benefits, the profits, etc. And definitely they are in the mainstream as far as the economic assumes that at least a strong tendency of the human motivations, because it is giving a direct benefit to the individual only. This will always be seeking the ways to improve their own positions. Agreements will consider only in those situations where both parties believe that a transaction will improve their own position. In such a situation, the competition among the rational and the self-interested individuals will continuously work to promote and for the overall benefits and the greatest overall benefits to the society at large. Whenever a situation occurs in which one or more individuals can attain an improvement in their own happiness without a net loss is the other happiness. The market forces will guarantee that this occurs. Thus, the market is seen as the most efficient means of utilitarianism and of the maximum happiness to the maximum number of the people. Now, coming on to the last part of today's lecture, what is the concept of the business policy and how do we relate to the utilitarianism is a main important thing which affects the business world. So, before moving on to the deontology ethics, that is a different way and a different theory of the ethical decision making, it will be very helpful if you understand the concept of the utilitarianism to some general concepts of the business ethics. At its most basic, utilitarianism is a social philosophy offering criteria by which the basic structure of the social institutions, such as the business and economy, ought to be determined, and the social institutions should be structured in whatever way will maximize the overall good for the society at large. There are so many critics of the utilitarianism theory, and they deny that this is not an adequate to complete social ethics. But among the utilitarianism, there is a disagreement about the best means for attracting the utilitarian goal. It will be very useful to introduce two versions of utilitarianism thinking at this point. In general, utilitarianism are committed whatever means and attain the ends on to the maximum happiness. On this, the policy questions are really pragmatic, which depends on the specific circumstances of time and place. Nevertheless, some general policy concerns can be identified. One version of utilitarianism public policy holds that there are experts who can predict the outcome of the various policies and carry out the policies that will attain our ends. These experts, usually trained in the social sciences such as economics, are familiar with the specifics of how society works and can therefore determine which policy will maximize the overall good. This approach of the public policy, one theory of entire administrative and bureaucratic side of the government. On this side, the legislative body from the Congress to the local city councils establishes that the public goals, and the administrative side, that is the presidents, governors, mayors, etc., they execute the policies to fulfill these goals. The people working within the administration and the classic government bureaucrats should know how the social and political systems work, and of course they use the knowledge to carry out the mandate for the legislature. The government is filled with such people typically trained in such fields of law, social sciences, public policy, and political science. This approach, for example, would justify the widespread government regulations of the business on the ground that such regulations will ensure the business activity and will surely contribute to the benefits of the business at large. However, consider how the Federal Reserve Boards sets the interest rates. There is an established goal of the public policy good. The Federal Reserve takes to be the greatest good for the country. This goal is something like highest sustainable rate of economic growth, which is compatible with the minimal inflation rate. The Fed examines the relevant economic data, makes a particular judgment about the present and the future state of economy. If the economic activity seems to be slowing down, the Fed might decide to veer and lower the interest rates as a means for stimulating the economic growth. If the economy seems to be growing too fast and the inflation rate is increasing, they might choose to raise the interest rates. Lowering or raising the interest rates in itself is neither good or bad. The rightness of act depends on the consequences. The role of the public relevant is to use his or her expert to judge the consequences of the decision making that is most likely to produce the best results. And of course, last but not the least, a second influential version of utilitarian policy invokes the tradition of Adam Smith and claims that the competitive markets are the best means of attaining the utilitarian goals. So this version would promote the policies, deregulate the private sector, protect the rights, allocate the free exchanges for the government, and of course in such situations the self-interest of the individuals and it leads to an invisible hand by the Adam Smith to maximize the satisfaction of the individual happiness. Thank you so much.
With this note, thank you ma'am, thank you so very much. Dear friends, if you wish to give your feedback for this particular lecture, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. Your questions as well as your feedback are welcome. We are going to meet again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you ma'am, thank you once again.